we'll go to some questions now. We have several questions that actually relate to your last comment that everybody made about the needle in the haystack. In other words, there's a lot of illegal immigrants, and they're all illegal immigrants, and law enforcement has to deal with them. But the security aspect, the potential terrorist, is a needle in the haystack. And we got several questions from listeners about how does that challenge change? How is it harder when the haystack gets bigger? Because we're seeing a new border surge gaining strength at the border as more people are being let go, and the previous administration's policies are being rolled back. We're seeing a new flow of people. When the haystack's bigger, how does that complicate finding the needle? And we had them directed at a couple of people, but whoever wants to take it, go ahead. Maybe Todd, if you had any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think I've expressed my opinion about that. I think it makes the activities that these operators are involved in normally very difficult, much more difficult to do. I know that, for example, the Biden administration over the weekend eliminated most of the ICE deportation activity, but left open this one exemption that it was for that they would still be there for deportation of terrorists or for national security related to terrorism. I haven't seen how that is going to be operationalized, but I'd like to hear what some of the panelists think about like this. When there is a big surge of mass migration, a mass surge at the border and through Latin America, how does that affect your ops?
This is Jim. I'll mention one thing is I think that everybody might be getting a little ahead of ourselves, right? It's a new administration coming in. There's obviously, I think, a lot of the perception is from folks is that they have the ability to come on caravans and get in the United States, right? They have these abilities this is an opportunity now that that all of a sudden there's not going to be any control at the border and so forth. So I think it'll be interesting to see over time, because this administration left. They're not oblivious to the national security and public safety threat that existed when they were here 4 years ago, right? It was on the forefront of their mind. So it'll be interesting to see over time of the reality versus the perception of a lot of this stuff is halting current practices so that they can put their own priorities in place. But what will be really interesting, I think, and that will be the long-term impact that we have. I think that we'll see that there'll be, you may be less inflammatory when you're talking about a group of people. I don't think the word alien, for example, was meant to be inflammatory. I think but at the same time, so let's call them whatever you want to call them. But it'll all come down to the how well the organizations are funded and the direction that they're given to do the work, and maybe through extraterritorial relationships and foreign relationships, maybe the stuff that Eddie was doing before he retired is even bolstered, right? Because if you don't get the caravan coming up to the southwest border, if you're working with your partners, that is never they never have the opportunity to go up the steps to get on your back porch. And so it'll be interesting to see is how we have a new administration that watched the rise and took the action of ISIS and got involved in the ISIS. There's a lot of knowledge base there. So it's just going to be, to me, I'm very eager to see, because these are experienced people that are being brought back into the government that lived the horror of what a terrorist attack can look like and be an impact it can have on you. So it'll be interesting to see what is the perception from the illegal immigrant community who thinks that this is an opportunity to mass migrate to the United States illegally, versus the perception of versus the reality of what controls are put in place and actually do have in place. I think that'll be really, I'm eager to see how this plays out long term.
Eddie or Norm, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just say the obvious answer to the question was yes. If the haystack gets bigger, finding the needle is harder. There's no doubt about it. You're going to have to streamline your triage. I remember when I was down on the border that we would get threats where a bomb threat had been called in at one of the international bridges. Well, what's that do? That backs everybody up for miles trying to get into the United States, pass through. So when, after the all clear was given, no, there's no bomb, which we knew there wasn't going to be a bomb. Now we got to let everybody through. Well, that puts the pressure on the people at the border, at the checkpoints, to move the traffic faster. So maybe they're not scrutinizing quite as much. Although I think they did a pretty darn good job. But anyway, in terms of the changes, not to be political, but I just counted down here, I served under 6 United States presidents, and it didn't, I can only think of one time under those 6, on one case, did I think it mattered who was president of the United States. I think the mission for the people that are down on the line, the gentleman you see here, that the mission for the most part was always the same. We took an oath to the Constitution, not to an administration. And I think, preventing a terrorist act was certainly, after 9/11, 2001 was a top priority.
Eddie, any thoughts on that haystack issue? The bigger the haystack?
Yes, I agree with both Norman and Jim, and 100% with everything they both said. And not to repeat it, but just to add to one point is that as a civilian now, I think back in my mind, all those, incredible, our sister agency, CBP, our brethren at FBI, DEA, Department of State, all the intelligence agencies, all those individuals are still working there, doing their job to protect our country. And then you throw in the host government counterparts that I had the honor to work with for many years down in Central America. This was a priority for them. They recognized that this was a threat country to, the security of the region, and their families. So that's just things all to keep in mind when you look at this.
We had a question from listener Patty about the costs. It obviously costs money even from Guatemala to get to the Texas border. But if you're coming from Central Asia or the Middle East, as Todd described in his book, or in his master's thesis, he called them ultra-marathoners of smuggling. It's a much longer distance. You have to fly. It costs a lot more. And so the question was, who's paying for that? How does that work? Where's the money come from? Any thoughts, Todd?
Well, I've interviewed a lot of SIAs myself, migrants, both on the intel side and as a journalist down in Panama on the migrant trails in Syria and the rest. And the answer that I almost always get is that somebody's uncle sold a plot of land somewhere to raise the money. Very often you can't really get an answer, but I suspect that nobody in Bangladesh got $30,000 for their trip. So I suspect that there are loans being made by the smuggling organizations, or that money is being raised by other family members. Some of them are actually in the United States, wiring money to migrants along the way as they make their way. Lots of different ways to. You can borrow it. You can get it from family members. You could sell an uncle's piece of land too. So
we have a question from a reporter. It's sort of several parts, but let me just pull one part of it out. And this is for anybody. Is there anything the Biden administration isn't currently doing that it should be doing to deal with this issue of trying to locate terrorists coming across the border? I mean, in other words, and it's not even necessarily just about the Biden administration. In other words, what else should we be doing or could we be doing to address this issue? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I think that one thing I'll say is that I think that in the United States we have a short memory. And we think that because everything's fine today, that tomorrow will be just as fine. And I wish that every one of our senior government officials and everyone at Congress goes to New York and walks through the 9/11, memorial, and remembers that on that morning we all thought when we woke up and went to work, we thought it was just going to be another beautiful day in America. And there's been many bad days after that, never to that amount, but quickly we forget that from the Boston Marathon bombing to you name it, some horrible instances, but never to that same magnitude. And we seem to bounce back really quick, which is great as a nation, but we also seem to forget. So my only call to everybody is let's not forget and become complacent. And I don't think that the enterprise has, right? Like the people that Eddie was talking about and Brian was talking about, those career people that are still there and they have 30 years on the job or 10 years on the job. And many of them today don't even remember 9/11 because they were kids when that happened, is we just can't become complacent to think that just because it didn't happen today, that it can't happen tomorrow. And I think that's what you see in Europe. People got complacent. And the next thing you know, they paid for it, and it's a lot harder to get ahead of it now that they've kind of neglected it and not had the forefront of their mind along the way.
Any last thoughts, Eddie and Norman, before I pass it back to Todd?
No, I just think I'll just add that I think it's this should be, if any issue should be bipartisan, this should be it. The protection of the United States, and so I'll just kind of leave it.
And I'd just like to add that to a little bit the memorial up in New York is to take those opportunities to get out of DC and go speak to that CBP officer down on the line or that HSI or FBI agent that are actually doing the interviews, taking the opportunity to go visit some of those posts, those embassies where our State Department people and actually see they'll get the reality there. There won't be any politics when they go and they see that. What they'll get is a real snapshot of the situation and a better of understanding, and probably help them, legislate a little better as well.
Thank you. Todd, do you have any thoughts on that, specifically anything additional that should be done, and then any last thoughts in general?
There's a few things. One, maybe chief among those would be to pay attention to changes in our asylum system, that we should remember most of the terrorists that infiltrated the European borders abused that asylum system, made up fake names and fake stories, and got in the crisis. And then that asylum process in the year, which is very similar to our own, based on all the same principles and some of the international law, had time to plot, and I think that our asylum system, I've got an entire chapter dedicated to the way that terrorists that we know of inside the United States that have reached the U.S. border have a system in the exact same way. That we should, that there needs to be a lot of attention paid to the changes that are happening now, and to make sure that whatever changes are going to take place between the last administration and this one on asylum takes into account special interest aliens. And the other thing is to Norman's SIA interview process. I know that they did start to triage after a while. The FBI was not doing it 24/7 to all SIAs. And when I was with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and I lay this out in the book as well, not to give away too much, but I know that a great many of those SIAs were not getting interviewed and were able to make bond and go out into the interior on their asylum claims. And that on its face is a higher risk for having, nobody's had a chance to really check them out, that their name isn't Mickey Mouse that they gave at the border. And also, lastly, I don't think that the SIA hunting endeavor, HSI's work in the Latin America, hunting down and breaking up these smuggling organizations, which create the bridge, have been appropriately evaluated to make sure that it's properly resourced. My sense from, and my own opinion based on my analysis and being involved in that for a long time, is that HSI probably needs more resources and more people to combat those SIA networks down there as a start. And one last thing, if I can get this in, is there's a chapter in my book that talks about embassies and consulate offices of the Latin American countries in the Middle East and in these countries, and of security and corruption breaches in those embassies and consulate offices, where smugglers are able to buy outright passports and documents, travel documents, out of these embassies and consulate offices, kind of to the highest bidder sort of a thing. And that a lot of our SIAs that are coming through purchase these things or get their smugglers to provide them the documents they need to cross the Atlantic. Somebody needs to take a good hard look at those Latin American embassies over abroad. And I've dedicated a chapter to that problem as well. And with that, I don't want to give up too much, but there are a lot of anecdotes in the book that illustrate all of these problems with real terrorists and real jihadists that were apprehended, SIA smugglers that were charged with material support for terrorism, guys that got to the border who were lying to the asylum officers about their involvement with al-Shabaab. And it goes on and on like that. There are too many stories like that. There should be zero of those.
Thank you, Todd, and I'd underline what Todd said. This is not kind of just a wonky, dry book. It's loaded with stories. Todd's background as a reporter, I think, informs this book. It's definitely worth reading. Again, it's America's Covert Border War by Todd Bensman from Bombardier Books. It's available in electronic form and in paperback wherever one buys books. I want to thank Todd and also thank our panelists for their firsthand insights into what's actually involved here, which is the kind of thing I think people in Washington often could benefit from, as Eddie suggested, getting out there. If they can't get out there to a consulate or a port of entry, at least they can read Todd's book about what's actually going on out there. Our discussion here will be posted to our website, cis.org, which also includes the rest of Todd's work and the work of our many other analysts and writers here that deal with the whole range of immigration issues. And thank all of you who are listening and tuning in, and hope to see you next time we do one of these panel discussions. Thank you.